Hi, so perhaps you are at the stage where you've got a sketch design and you are ready to start to really make sure that that's right for you and it's what you want to build. So this is, I've just got myself a little notification that I've gone live here. That was what that buzzing was about. If you are at this point where you now want to just make sure that it's the right thing for you to do, you want to go forward, well, these are the technical things that it's worth checking. And really, I'm going to go through what to check, or at least some of the things that the main things to check. There are so many things that you could check more than this, but these are the basics. Why you want to do this checking is kind of the same for all of these things, and really they're all to do with the existing condition of your building or the soil or something around the site of where you're planning to build, and they are things for you to check that will have some cost implication, and also will have some implication on what's possible. So whether that's because of the budget, because something, when you carry out these checks, you might find a situation, for example, asbestos, which may then be too expensive for you to remove, and so you're better keeping it in place. And in that case, perhaps you would change what it is you're going to do to the building to avoid damaging or having to remove that asbestos. So that's just one example, and I'll go through each of these in different ways, but essentially what you're doing is checking the technical situation and what could have a cost implication, and then you are in that position where you can take that information into account, and you can either add that work into your project knowing that it has a cost associated with it, and knowing that that then has to fit within your budget. And then perhaps if you are needing to, you could do some value engineering where you look at changing the scope of work or reducing the work in other places so that your costs come down overall in other areas, so that they can account for this additional cost that you've identified doing this checking out work. Or you can add in some money to your budget to cover extra work that you've identified that's going to be entailed. So either way, but it just gives you the chance to have a really more informed decision and know what it's going to cost you at the end of your project and what's going to happen. So those are the benefits really to doing this: having more control, having less surprises as you go through the project, or when you come onto site, having a big surprise that ends up you having to plough loads of money in, and then you're not able to achieve what you thought you were going to achieve. So I'll go through these different kinds of, they're basically all types of surveys. So these are all different technical checks that you can have done on your building or on your land before you start work. And I recommend doing this when you have sketch designs done, but you are not yet fixed on what you're going to do design wise, so that yes, you've got sketch designs, yes, you've got a good idea of the sorts of things that you want to achieve, but then you might not actually, because those sketch designs won't be based on all the information possible. Having these surveys in place gives you more information, so you can make better informed decisions about how you want your design to be developed after the sketch designs. So the very first one, and I'd say this is probably the most important one, is a structural survey. So this is particularly important if you want to add extra load onto your existing building. So perhaps you want to add a dormer, you want to add a second floor onto a ground floor, so a first floor onto a ground floor. So you are increasing weight onto existing foundations. And so what I recommend is a structural survey that includes for digging down like a trial pit next to the foundations to see how deep the foundations are, what they bear onto, so that that information, a structural engineer can use that to then calculate whether you need to underpin or do some other sorts of strengthening work or add something in to make sure that your foundation is going to be adequate for the extra weight that you're going to put on it. And then the other thing is to take soil tests. So different types of soil will require different kinds of foundations. Different kinds of foundations and ground floor build-ups have different amounts of cost associated with them. Really poor ground might need piling, which is incredibly expensive in comparison to a relatively shallow trench fill. Those are just 2 examples, there are others. And so having an understanding of what the soil type is will also be something that your structural engineer can take into account when designing your foundations, and that will help. So that kind of work, a lot of the time people don't get structural engineers involved until much later, but I would recommend having them involved much earlier, and perhaps also putting together a sketch design based on your architectural sketch design, so that then you can get some costings that take into account both the architectural sketch design and the structural sketch design. Not essential, but it's one way for you to really get some costs and checks in place and understand the decisions you're making and have them based on, you know, the reality of the structure. And then another really important thing for older property, particularly if there are signs of cracking and movement, is to have a structural defects analysis, so they can really check out what is it that's going wrong, what's the situation of the building itself structurally, and is there anything that you need to do to stop it from moving so much, to prevent more cracking in the future, or to make sure that any works that you're doing to change the building are not going to make that worse, or all those sorts of things. So structural survey, that is, I'd say, the key, the basic one, the main one to do. And the next one is a drainage survey. Drainage surveys, most people don't do them, and I actually think that it would be useful to have a drainage survey whenever you buy a house, because the drains you don't know what's going on underground, and they can be the biggest source of unexpected costs at the very start of a project. Because sometimes, and I've had this happen, the drains are much lower, like several meters lower than you expect, and that can have an impact on how far down you need to dig for your foundations, and obviously how much concrete then you need to pour. And that's all just money that you're literally pouring into the ground. You're not going to see it. It's going to have no real visible, tangible benefit to you later on. So knowing what condition your drains are in and where they are is really useful, and can really help you at least either know where they are and budget for it, and be in position to know what works are going to be needed to account for the drains as they are, or to adjust your line so that they don't need to impact on the drain. And there are other things to do with drains, like whether they are shared or private owned, whether you own them or whether they're the responsibility of your utility company. Those things can also have an impact on drains. So drains underground, not really seen, kind of ignored, but they are really important to get that checked out early on. Electrics. Now, especially if you are interested in what I call kind of eco bling. So I follow more of a fabric first approach for eco design, which is more to do with having the good levels of insulation and higher quality windows and things like that, so you are maintaining the heat inside your home. But then you can add like eco bling, which is like photovoltaic panels, solar thermal panels, air source, ground source heat pumps, all the kind of renewable technologies. and there are lots of other technologies. So adding those on, but they all relate to electrics. So getting the condition of your existing electric circuitry, motherboard, you know, all the motherboard, that's computing, but you know, all the basics of the electrics, getting those checked out, finding out what condition they're in, and having an allowance for whether you need to fully rewire or change any significant parts. Knowing that early on is worth knowing, and also what capacity it has to be added onto and adapted. Really significant one is asbestos, and asbestos can really surprise you. I did some work on a beautiful Victorian villa in a lovely conservation area, and I walked in and I didn't expect there to be any asbestos really, but it had some interesting work done to it back in the 60s, and I thought actually it's worth them having a check. And they actually discovered that some of the ceilings were asbestos in just one of the smaller rooms where we had been thinking about doing some work. And it was such a small room, and the work that we'd been thinking about was really relatively minor, and so we literally just left that off the work list because the cost of and the disruption and of removing that what was relatively small area of asbestos didn't need. You can safely leave asbestos in place as long as it's protected from damage and it's not going to get damaged. So really, if you can do that, because the removal of it also then disturbs the asbestos and releases the fibres and so on. So actually it's safer to leave asbestos in place if it can be done safely, you know, if it's not going to get disturbed. So asbestos is a big thing, and it's also really expensive to remove, and you know, you have to get the right people to do it. So it's one of those things, it's worth having an asbestos survey. If your home is older than like 1970s built, anything before then, there are chances that is asbestos there. And you know, for your health and for the builder's health and anybody else who's in or working on and around the property, you know, you don't want to have your home harming you. If somebody comes in and drills a hole through a ceiling to fit a new light fitting, and you don't know that ceiling has got an asbestos artex or something on it, and it could have been that it's covered up. Often people skim over artex, and so they leave it be underneath, and actually there could be asbestos behind another layer of plaster that you don't know about. So it's really worth getting an asbestos survey for your own health and safety firstly, but also because there are costs involved in it. Knowing if there is any and where it is will really help you to identify what work to do, what work to avoid, and any costs associated with dealing with that asbestos if it needs to be. So those are like really pretty common: structural, drainage, electrical and asbestos. They're pretty common throughout. But then there are some additional ones that could be worth doing. So there's more of an ecological one, so perhaps for things like bats and newts, and if you know that you've got really quite a lot of wildlife around your home, this might be something that you should do or could do. And this, you know, a lot of people are really interested in this themselves. I had a client who was, you know, wanted to incorporate bird boxes and bat boxes and all sorts of things into their home because they love nature and wildlife, wanted to, you know, make more capacity for those animals and creatures to live close to them so that they could watch them and really they got a lot of pleasure from watching wildlife around them, and they really cared about it. So, you know, if that's you, that it could be something that you could do out of interest, but it also, you could then feed that information back into your design. And if you do discover that there's a, you know, an unusual bat species or something like that, you could actually incorporate some kind of bat roosting boxes and things like that into your roof perhaps, so that you make it possible for those little creatures to live close by and you can really enjoy them. maybe even incorporate cameras and things like that. So that's one option. And then another one is trees. Trees are a really attractive feature. They can also be quite damaging and restricting. So the technical jargon term, if you like, for somebody who would do a tree surgeon is an arboriculturalist. So those are people who specialise in trees and understand a lot about trees. And if there are particularly older, more protected trees in your area, especially if you've got tree protection orders or it's conservation area, then knowing what trees you've got and what condition they're in, and also then having some understanding of what measures you need to put into place throughout your build in order to protect those trees from any damage. And the actual tree roots will extend further than the canopy of the tree, so it could be that you need to make allowance within the foundation types, maybe even piling if there's a lot of tree roots nearby. And there are different things that you can do to minimise the building's impact on those trees, and you may be required to do that. You might not have a choice, and that can also have a cost impact. And then finally, what I hadn't noted on here is if you have a home that is in a conservation area or perhaps is a listed building, then getting someone to do more of an archival research, historical research on your building, it may be of interest to you anyway. If you're quite keen on history and you'd like to know who's lived in your home before, who built it, how many people have worked in your home and things like that in the past, if it's a big old property, that could be really interesting. But those sorts of historical information, if it is has some like listed building status or is in a really highly protected conservation area, then having that understanding of the history of the building and the qualities of that history, how important and significant it is from lots of historical viewpoints, like social importance, status and economic importance, technological importance. There's lots of different things that could be important, cultural importance, all these different things, but having that sort of historical archive look at your home and getting a report on that can really help with knowing what aspects of the building you need to be sensitive to and what you need to prevent getting damage during work. And then obviously there can be some costs associated with doing that if it's protection work or reinstating things and that kind of stuff. So having that can really help. That was it really. Those were things for today. So structural survey, drainage survey, electrics, asbestos, ecological, so bats and newts and all of that sort of thing, arboricultural, which is trees, and historical kind of archive research. So those are really useful to have because they can really feed into your project. They can help enrich it, if you're interested in the historical aspect or you're interested in the bats and the birds and things, like special things that live and are in and around your home, and you'd like to incorporate some of those things into the design itself. They can really influence, you can use those to influence and inspire you, but you can also use that information to give you really informed choices about what you do for your home and what impact those might have in terms of budget. And I know budget, if it's a big budget or if it's a small budget, there tends to be a budget that you're working within, and so being able to make your decisions on what you include based on your budget and having this information will really help you. So I hope that's been useful. If you have any questions at all about these kind of technical things to check out, please let me know. I'll come back and check on comments and respond to them, and I look forward to speaking to you again next week. Bye for now.